The Investiary is a room inside the Imperial Palace on Terra. 20 plinths of oulsite marble arranged in a silent ring. Each one carries a life-size statue of one of the Emperor's sons, every Primarch preserved in permanent stone record, standing in exactly the position the imperial hierarchy assigned him. The room was built to remember. 2 of those plinths are empty. Rogel Dorn stands in the falls of the Kathmandu precinct and registers the absence. The second plinth, the 11th. In Dan Abnett's short story, The Lightning Tower, set during the siege of Terra, Dorn looks at those vacancies and thinks, the 2nd and 11th plinths had been vacant for a long time. No one ever spoke of those 2 absent brothers. Their separate tragedies had seemed like aberrations. Had they, in fact, been warnings that no one had heeded? He doesn't know their names. He can't quite reconstruct why he doesn't know them. The official record labels them 2 and 11.
In the Horus Heresy Book 1, Betrayal, the Alan Bly Forge World Supplement, the first source to present the full Space Marine Legion listing in appendix form. Both entries carry identical language. Deleted from Imperial records, authorization unknown. Lexicanum confirms this. The Warhammer 40,000 fandom wiki confirms it. Every source that catalogs the first founding arrives at the same 2 gaps, the same 2 words. Established lore, consistent across every Horus Heresy supplement, states 20 Primarchs existed. 2 were erased. 18 remained when the heresy broke. Aaron Dembski-Bowden's The First Heretic gives the timeline. Lorgar says, I fear the Emperor will break the word-bearers, and break me. We would be cast alongside the brothers we no longer speak of. That conversation is set roughly 43 standard years before the drop site massacre on Istvan V. By then, the 2 Primarchs were already gone. Already unspeakable. The erasure preceded the heresy.
The I through XX sequence isn't a neutral ledger of 20 designs. It's a survivor list, shaped by what it can't contain. The previous video on this channel established, from the Primarch's canonical roles and complementary natures across the Horus Heresy series, that the Emperor appears to have designed his sons in structural pairs. Strategist and Shadow, Berserker and Empath, Builder and Destroyer. The argument was taxonomic. You can pair every documented Primarch with a counterpart whose nature defines its limits. The structural implication of that framework is that every Primarch should have a counterpart. Every Primarch except one. Magnus the Red, Primarch 15. Crimson King, Sorcerer King of the Thousand Suns. The most psychically powerful being among the 20. The Warhammer 40,000 fandom wiki describes him as, above all his brothers, the most numinous, a psyker of prodigious power. His psychic reach was present before birth. Lexicanum's Magnus entry confirms he possessed a form of psychic communication with his father even during his gestation. A detail the fandom wiki notes may thus have been planned by the Emperor as an intentional attribute engineered within his genetic structure. Designed warp dominance, deliberate, intentional, built into the geneseed before any gestation capsule was ever opened. In the pair system framework, that level of warp dominance predicts a counterpart, something that defines its limit, something the warp can't reach. There is no documented null counterpart to Magnus in the I through XX sequence. No warp-silent Primarch, no structural anchor. The pair position exists in the framework's logic. The sequence doesn't contain it.
One sentence
clearly stated before building the case. No Games Workshop source numbers a Primarch 0. The framework that follows is the strongest read of available structural and canonical evidence, not a GW-confirmed lore entry. That constraint doesn't weaken the argument, it defines what the argument is. The channel's Null Primarch video drew a comment with 7 likes and 7 separate replies. It read, "I think the null mark is actually numbered 0. 2 was probably a coward, and 11 probably rose up in defiance of the Emperor, either of their own volition or via Xeno influence. The null mark is an entity all its own, and either on the world, in orbit around that black hole, or on some other mission." A reader, working from the pair system anchor video alone, without access to this argument's documentation logic or its warp mechanic scaffolding, arrived at the same destination from structure.
They distinguished the Null March from Primarch.2 and Primarch.11, treated them as 3 separate entities with separate fates, and placed the Null Primarch entirely outside the canonical sequence. They assigned him a number, 0. A second comment drew 16 likes. Fun fact, the Null Primarch has a poster of Gunner First Class Ferric Jurgen in his bedroom. That's a joke that earns its likes. Ferric Jurgen, documented in Lexicanum as a Valhallan Ice Warriors trooper, adjutant to Commissar Caiaphas Kane across multiple campaigns, is a blank, a psychic null, the pariah gene. His presence creates a dead zone in the warp around him, a zone of almost physical discomfort for nearby psychers, a complete absence of soul resonance that makes him invisible to warp entities and invaluable to Kane in close encounters with demons. 16 people understood immediately what the joke was, recognizing. A null Primarch would know what Jurgen was worth.
The Emperor didn't begin the Primarch program with 20 fully designed candidates. He began with iteration. The Lexicanum Primarch project entry opens by establishing context from before 792.m30. The Emperor had already been fighting on Terra with genetically modified warriors, but in the end they proved hyper-violent and short-lived. The Thunder Warriors, enhanced soldiers who fought the Unification Wars, led by officer-rank commanders Lexicanum calls Primarchs, who were simply skilled humans rather than genetically unique beings, were the prior generation, powerful, unstable, incapable of the restraint the Great Crusade would require. They were superseded.
3 contributors built what followed. The Emperor himself, the perpetual Erda, confirmed in Dan Abnett's Saturnine as the Primarch's genetic mother, a geneticist whose rare gene stock was combined with the Emperor's DNA to produce the Primarch genome, documented in Lexicanum's Erda entry, and Biotechnical Division Director Amar Astarte, who oversaw the accelerated gene culturing chambers in the hidden laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains. 3 contributors, working with both conventional genetics and warp sorcery simultaneously, building on lessons the Thunder Warriors had taught at great cost. Astarte is worth pausing on. The Primarch project entry, sourcing from Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, records that she came to believe the Primarch project and the whole of the Legiones Astartes were doomed, and attempted to destroy the genetic knowledge behind their creation.
That isn't the response of someone who watched 20 designs run cleanly to completion before disaster struck.
It's the response of someone who understood the project's fragility from inside, who knew that what the Gene Labs produced had been operating close to its limits even before the ruinous powers intervene. The Lexicanum Primarch article lists, under a section titled Similar Entities, a being called the Angel, described as a humanoid bioweapon developed to destroy the Emperor's enemies, noted explicitly as an entity that predates the numbered Space Marine legions. The Angel isn't Subject Zero. It isn't null gene, but its presence in the taxonomy, a pre-sequence being operating at near Primarch scale, built for a specific function, predating the numbered sequence, establishes the pattern. The Emperor built predecessors. The numbered 20 were the product of that process, not its beginning.
What the iterations produced before committing to the final sequence isn't fully documented, because documentation began when the sequence did. That is the canonical scaffolding for Subject Zero. Not proof of him, precedent for his structural type. A pre-sequence prototype built for a specific function, existing only in the gap its destruction left. The gap it left is Magnus. Understood precisely, what Magnus is tells you exactly what his structural counterpart would need to have been. His warp reach began before birth. His psychic communication with the Emperor during gestation is unique among the 20. Not one other Primarch is documented to have had that level of warp contact before their gestation capsule landed anywhere. When the Thousand Sons Legion was formed from Magnus's gene seed and fought its first actions during the Great Crusade, the Legion immediately began displaying psychic abilities. The fandom wiki records that approximately 5 standard years into the Great Crusade, the Thousand Sons demonstrated powerful psychic talents across the Legion. The psychic trait wasn't a product of Prospero or of Great Crusade experience. It was present from the first generation of recruits. Magnus's gene seed reliably produces psychers. What that gene seed also produces, when pushed to instability, is the flesh change, a runaway mutation tied directly to the psychic volatility of Magnus's genome. Before the Thousand Sons were even permitted to join the Great Crusade in earnest, they were tearing themselves apart genetically. The fandom wiki documents that Magnus eventually halted the mutations through a bargain with a warp entity he didn't correctly identify, Tzeentch, operating in disguise. The deal temporarily stopped the flesh change. It cost Magnus his right eye. The Thousand Sons owed their survival to a pact with the Changer of Ways, made before most of the Great Crusade had begun. The warp had been reaching for his legion since before they had their first campaigns. An anchor for this reach would need to be its exact opposite in kind. Not psychically powerful, psychically absent. Not warp adjacent, warp invisible. The Lexicanum blank entry establishes what that looks like in the lore. Blanks, untouchables, pariahs, psychic nulls, are confirmed mutants whose gene stock makes them invisible in the alternate dimension of the warp. The mechanism isn't resistance or shielding, it's absence. The warp can't perceive them. Chaos entities can't form targeting solutions through warp-based methods. The effect extends outward, creating a zone of almost physical wrongness for any being whose nature is warp-adjacent. For a blank operating at Primarch scale, that zone wouldn't produce a localized disruption. It would produce a defined boundary, a hard edge on the warp's reach that no negotiation, no bargain, no whispered promise from Tzeentch could cross. Subject Zero, in this framework, was that boundary. Built first because you design the counterweight before the system it counterweights, the null before the psyker, the absence before the presence. The simpler component stabilized first so the more volatile one has a reference point. He was destroyed before Magnus was decanted. The creation process, described across multiple canonical sources as a configuration involving Erda's genetic contribution, forbidden sciences, warp sorcery, and what the fandom wiki describes as an unimaginable price, admitted no simple substitution. Losing a prototype at that investment level forced design revision. The Emperor couldn't remake a null gene Primarch from the original template once that template was gone. The response was to continue the numbered sequence without the prototype's paired design, and to ensure the evidence of the failed attempt was buried before the count began. The Roman numeral system has no zero. Every Roman numeral sequence begins at 1 because Roman numerals were constructed without a symbol for 0. The 1 through 20 Primarch sequence starts at 1 because that is how Roman numerals work, not because someone deliberately omitted a 0 slot. That null hypothesis deserves direct acknowledgement. The sequence begins at I because sequences in this notation begin at I. The null hypothesis applies to the symbol. It doesn't address what existed before the symbol system was applied, or what institutional machinery ensured that the pre-sequence phase was sealed before documentation started. The Investiary wasn't a passive record.
The Fandom Wiki's Lost Primarchs article describes the formal erasure of Primarchs 2 and 11 as the application of an edict of obliteration, damnatio memoria, and describes it as the most successful edict of obliteration ever carried out in imperial history. The scale of that success requires active institutional coordination. The administratum, the sigillites office, the custodians of Terra's data vaults, Legion homeworlds, the physical destruction of statues, symbols, icons, and whatever surviving records existed after the scattering. This doesn't happen passively. It requires an institution that knows what it's erasing and has a developed mechanism for doing so. That institution is documented in Chris Wraith's audiobook, The Sigillite. Malcador and an operative named Caleb pass through the dungeons of the Imperial Palace and arrive at a massive door, the location of the original Primarch project laboratory before a second facility was constructed.
The door is covered in Legion symbols. Caleb notices that 2 of those symbols have been scratched out or worn away. He asks Malcador about them. Malcador brushes it off and walks. This is how the redaction functions, not through the destruction of the door itself, but through deliberate, targeted removal of specific elements from the record, combined with an instruction not to press for explanation. The scratched symbols are still there. The door is still there. The acknowledgement that something once occupied those positions is implicit in the very act of removing it. The redaction is visible precisely because of what it chose to obscure. The institutional scale of the protocol applied to Primarchs 2 and 11 is confirmed across multiple name sources.
Lexicanum's Primarch 2 entry, drawing on the short story The Chamber at the End of Memory, states that the memories of everyone involved with the lost Primarch were wiped, records of his deeds expunged, and an oath was sworn by those who could still vaguely recall him not to speak of him anymore. Memory wipes, record purges, sworn oaths, applied universally, coordinated by Malcador. The last council documents what happened when Horus attempted to break that protocol at a Council of Terra session held sometime between 981 M30 and 000 M31. Moving to speak a lost Primarch's name openly in defiance, Horus was choked psychically by Malcador, mid-word before the name could be completed. That's not an administrative procedure. That's active suppression, in real time, by the individual holding the most institutional knowledge of what was erased.
Multiple independent readers of Dan Abnett's Saturnine report a scene during the Siege of Terra in which Rogel Dorn discovers a vault connected to one of the lost Primarchs. Malcador appears, temporarily restores Dorn's blocked memories, and Dorn, understanding what he remembers, requests that the memory be taken again. He votes for his own forgetting. Dorn, standing in the Cath Mandau precinct in the Lightning Tower, looking at 2 empty plinths and unable to fully articulate why the names are gone. That's what chosen forgetting looks like 20 years after the choosing. Subject Zero's erasure in the framework was the first time this protocol ran. The procedure existed before Primarchs 2 and 11 were erased. The Emperor had used it already. The Malkador institution was operational before the numbered sequence, and its first application covered the thing that predated the numbers entirely. 0 isn't a number the Roman system can assign.
It names the position the Roman system can't represent. Before 1, after nothing. Not a plinth in the Investiary, because the Investiary was built after him. Not an entry in the Legion listing, because the listing begins where the documentation begins. 0 is the name the audience gives retroactively to the gap the sequence can't show. There is a thematic parallel worth naming here. Not canonical evidence, but the same structural shape. In 1990, Games Workshop published Realm of Chaos, The Lost and the Damned, a sourcebook that introduced Malal, a fifth chaos god, the embodiment of self-destruction and contradiction, a deity whose power turns against chaos itself. Malal's nature, as preserved in community-documented sourcebook material, the embodiment of chaos's indiscriminate and anarchic tendency toward destruction, including itself and its own agents. Negation, undoing, self-erasure as an operating principle. Malal was removed from official canon, not through any in-universe event. His co-creator left Games Workshop and retained the copyright. Malal disappeared from official documentation through a real-world institutional mechanism, not an edict of obliteration, but a legal instrument with functionally the same effect. His absence now organizes the remaining four-god theology around a gap that can't be formally acknowledged, an entity defined by negation, erased from the official record by institutional forces, whose absence structures what remains around a gap it can't show. Subject 0 predates the canonical Primarch sequence. Malal predates current official canon. Both are visible only in what the record leaves out. Blanks are canonically imperceptible to warp entities. A null gene Primarch operating at Primarch scale would project that imperceptibility outward, not a dead zone in a corridor, but a fundamental disruption to the warp's ability to register that location at all. Daemons can't perceive a blank zone. The Chaos Gods can't target through it directly. The standard corruption mechanisms, visions, whispers, psychic intrusions, the subtle bending of fate that worked on Lorgar and Horus over years. None of them function against a being who doesn't register in the warp's perception. Warp blindness doesn't translate to physical invulnerability. White Dwarf 501 documents this in the modern setting. During the Indomitus Crusade era, Abaddon the Despoiler, Fabius Bile, and a third named commander deployed physical chaos forces into the Pariah Nexus territories, null field zones where warp-based assault is impossible. The Chaos Gods couldn't perceive the interior of the Nexus. Their response was to send armies to the border. The armies moved in physically, fought physically, and died physically. The Pariah Nexus wasn't immune to chaos. It was immune to the warp-based targeting chaos usually relies on. That's a different thing, and the distinction matters for every null field entity that has ever operated in this setting. The Rangdan Xenocides provide the historical context for how that workaround might have looked in M30. 3 campaigns, documented in the Horus Heresy Book 9 Crusade and the Scions of the Emperor Anthology, against the Xenos known as the Rangda during the late 800s of M30. The scale required Legion-level responses across multiple engagements. Lexicanum's Rangdan Xenocides article
confirms the Space Wolves prevented a major disaster at the Magend Torque transgression during the Second Xenocide in 881 M30. The Rangda deployed biological weapons capable of irrevocably infecting biological organisms, forcing subsequent Legion-scale purges of affected forces. One sourced account places losses approaching 50,000 Astartes across the campaign series.
The fandom wiki confirms that the long-lost 2nd and 11th Legions participated in the campaigns of the Rangdan Xenocides during the Great Crusade in the 860s. M30. Primarch II's Legion was in those campaigns. Whether Primarch II personally died there isn't confirmed in any primary source. Lexicanum's entry states only that sometime before Monarchia was raised in 964, M30, roughly a century after he had been rediscovered, the second Primarch met his grim fate. A commenter named Azriel Maximus, drawing one like on the Null Primarch video, wrote, "2 was a Xenos lover. Rangdan genocides. 11 is a null in stasis under the palace. Dorn finds the vault. Malkador appears out of nowhere. Dorn wants to know. Malkador unlocked his memory. Dorn asks for the memory be erased during the siege of Terra." The second half of that comment, Dorn finding a vault, Malkador restoring blocked memories, Dorn choosing erasure, is consistent with what multiple readers independently report from Saturnine.
That scene, whatever its exact content, has the redaction protocol running as described. The mechanism exists. The institutional actor exists. The procedure is documented. The Rangdan represent exactly the class of physical realm threat that warp-targeted assassination can't produce. They don't operate through the immaterium. They operate through biological weapons, military campaigns, and forces that function without warp guidance. If the warp determined that a null gene Primarch at prototype scale needed to be eliminated, deploying a warp-indifferent Xenos threat into his operational region is the mechanical solution the lore's own rules predict. The forces don't need to target him through the warp. They need to reach his physical coordinates. That argument is bounded inference, not confirmed canon. It's the mechanism that makes Subject Zero's death coherent within the lore's established rules for both null field entities and chaos military strategy.
Physical realm assassination of a warp-invisible target. No warp involvement at the moment of contact, followed immediately by an erasure protocol that was already operational, applied to a prototype whose existence predated the documentation system entirely. After Subject Zero was destroyed, the Emperor made a design decision. Continue forward with the Psyker design without its intended anchor and fold the lesson of the failure into the structure of what followed. Magnus the Red is Primarch 15. His discovery date is 840 M30, 9th of the 20 to be found. Creation dates and discovery dates are different records. The lab sequence and the discovery sequence don't map onto each other. Canon doesn't document which Primarch was created first in the Himalayan gene labs, and that silence is part of the evidentiary foundation here. What canon does confirm about the creation process, it was unrepeatable. Multiple sources describe the design of the Primarchs as involving a configuration: Erda's genetic contribution, forbidden sciences, warp sorcery, the Emperor's own DNA. So costly that the loss of any design meant revision rather than reproduction. The Emperor couldn't remake Subject Zero from a lost null gene template. The response was to continue the numbered sequence without the prototype's paired design and bury the evidence of the failed attempt before the count started. The pairs system, under this framework, becomes legible as an engineering response to that lesson. Lose a solo design, and you lose it permanently,
Unrepeatable process, no recovery. Build designs in complementary pairs, and the loss of one doesn't eliminate the surviving design's function entirely, because the pair's shared nature means the remaining design carries the partial architecture of what was lost. The pairs system is redundancy through complementarity.
Structural insurance against a catastrophic single-point failure that Subject 0 represented. The only design of its kind, destroyed before it could be replicated. No canonical source describes the Emperor explicitly designing the 20 in complementary pairs for this reason. The argument is that the structure of the 20 implies the lesson was learned, and Subject 0 is the most coherent source of that lesson. The prototype that predated the pairs. The one whose destruction demonstrated why solo designs fail. Magnus, built to continue without Subject 0's anchor, represents both the lesson's application and its persistent gap. The lesson produced the pairs. It didn't retroactively produce a null counterpart for the Primarch already built without one. Read Graham McNeil's 1,000 Suns through this frame, and the arc reads differently. Magnus is the most powerful psyker of his generation. He knows this.
His certainty, the absolute conviction that his reach places him beyond the constraints applying to lesser psychers, is the engine of everything that goes wrong for him. The arrogance isn't cruelty. It's the belief that maximum capability exempts him from maximum caution, that the warnings are aimed at beings less capable than himself. He's right that he's more capable than anyone around him. He's wrong about what operating at that capacity, without a defined limit, will eventually cost. The arc is a series of decisions made without an edge to push against. He conceals the 1,000 Suns' second wave of mutations from the Emperor because he believes he can solve it unilaterally. He bargains with a warp entity he doesn't correctly identify, Tzeentch in disguise, because he's confident he can control the terms of the deal. The deal works by its own negotiated logic. He believes he won. He bargained with the changer of ways and got what he asked for. That isn't winning. That is being played by a being whose entire domain is manipulation, who wanted Magnus to believe he mastered the interaction. At the Council of Nicaea, Magnus argues against the prohibition on sorcery on grounds that his sophistication exceeds the risk the prohibition is designed to address. The Emperor rules against him. Magnus, outwardly compliant, returns to Prospero and continues his experiments privately. He has concluded that the warning doesn't apply to him specifically. The defining moment is the astral projection. Magnus learns of Horus's treachery during the Great Crusade's final years. A warp storm blocks conventional astropathic communication to Terra. Magnus deploys what he believes is his most powerful tool. He projects himself astrally through the warp toward Terra, finds a webway corridor leading beneath the Imperial Palace, and tears through it using borrowed power from an anonymous warp voice. He delivers his warning. The breach releases demons into the webway.
The Emperor's secret project. A webway infrastructure intended to free humanity from warp-based travel entirely, is irreversibly destroyed in the moment of Magnus's greatest act of filial loyalty. Primarch-scale psychic reach, operating at full extension without a null anchor. Not malicious, not corrupt at that specific moment. The design operating exactly as designed, at the edge of its capacity, beyond any mechanism to stop it. Subject 0 was supposed to be that mechanism. Not by physically restraining Magnus. A null Primarch doesn't cage a psyker. His null field defines the warp's edge. Magnus, operating in proximity to a null gene Primarch of equivalent scale, would have had a physical reference point for how far was too far. The discomfort of the null field, expanding outward from his paired counterpart,
would have been his nervous system telling him, "Here is where the warp can't follow me, and here is where I stop."
Without that boundary, Magnus ran every calculation about his own limits in a vacuum. He was the most powerful warp instrument in the galaxy and had no point of reference for maximum safe extension. The webway breach answered the question his design never had a mechanism to ask. The post-heresy trajectory confirms the direction. His surviving 1,000 suns, transformed by Ahriman's rubric, cast after the burning of Prospero to halt the flesh change, are dust-filled armor suits, their souls warp-bound inside ceramide. Magnus himself spends the millennia on Sortiarius, the planet of the sorcerers, inside the Eye of Terror, inside the immaterium he was always reaching toward. The fandom wiki documents his ultimate canonical position. Daemon Prince of Tzeentch, called the Crimson King, his identity now inseparable from the entity that played him across 20,000 years. He believes the Imperium betrayed him.
He's not wrong about the mechanics. Leman Russ came to Prospero on the Emperor's order, and the burning destroyed centuries of Magnus's work. But Magnus doesn't have access to the full frame. He doesn't know his architecture was always incomplete. He doesn't know the betrayal began before he existed, that the being designed to be his limit was destroyed before he was decanted, and the Emperor chose to continue. Magnus inherited a gap and spent 20,000 years inside it without knowing the gap was there. The 16-like comment understood this intuitively. It imagined a Primarch who would recognize Ferric Jurgen as something close to kin, not because Jurgen is powerful or famous, but because Jurgen is the figure who consistently anchors the most dangerous psychic situations Kane encounters and brings everyone through intact. His null field is what makes demonic proximity survivable. He is, functionally, the anchor that extreme psychic situations need and rarely have.
Subject Zero would have understood exactly what Jurgen was. Magnus has never had one. He has been the most psychically powerful being in his generation, operating without an anchor since before the Great Crusade began. Every novel in his arc is the story of a design that was never meant to run alone. No Games Workshop source numbers a Primarch 0. That belongs here at the end, restated clearly. The framework built across this video rests on specific canonical foundations. The confirmed structural gap where Magnus's null counterpart would appear in the pair system. The Emperor's documented iterative design process, including the Thunder Warrior generation before the Primarchs, and pre-numbered entities like the Angel, listed in Lexicanum's own taxonomy. The canonical warp mechanics of blanks, confirmed in Lexicanum's blank entry. Chaos's documented use of physical forces to overcome null field zones, recorded in White Dwarf 501's Pariah Nexus material. The institutional redaction protocol confirmed across the Sigillite, the Chamber at the End of Memory, the Last Council, the Saturnine Dorn scene described consistently by multiple readers, and the Lightning Tower. And Magnus's arc as documented across 1,000 Suns, and the Lexicanum and Fandom wiki entries. All of that is canonical scaffolding for a structure that contains a gap. The framework names what fits the gap. GW hasn't named it.
The comment section arrived at the same name from structural evidence alone. 7 likes, before any of this argument was assembled. That doesn't prove the framework. It confirms the framework is legible from the material, that the gap is visible enough that careful readers can see the shape of what's missing and name it without the argument being handed to them. He was numbered 0 because 0 is what he became in the record, not a plinth in the Investiary, not an entry in the Legion listing, Not a name Rogel Dorn can speak even when he almost remembers it. The null. The erased. The prototype the documentation system couldn't mark because the documentation system started after him. Magnus the Red has been replacing Subject 0 for 20,000 years and doesn't know it. The pair system anchor established that every Primarch has a counterpart.
This video closes on the one exception. And the reason the exception exists is that the counterpart came first, and the evidence of that precedence was buried before the count began. Drop the number you would assign him below. Whatever draws the most likes becomes the next video in the series. Subscribe if you want to see where the count goes.